video lecture will cover the definition and the physical changes associated with the period of life that we refer to as adolescence. It's worth pointing out that adolescence is what's referred to as a social construct. In other words, it is physiologically, it's this period, socially, it's this period between when a person is considered a child and when they're considered an adult. But every culture treats this period different. Matter of fact, some cultures, there is no transition. You go from being a child to an adult. There's not this period in between. But for our purposes, we're defining adolescence as this period that runs between being considered a child in our culture and being considered a full-fledged adult. Um, in the discussion post, I'll ask you to consider what that period exactly is. When are you an adult? Some people might say that you're an adult at 18. Other people might say no, not till 21. Yet still at 21 in our culture, you can't take full opportunity of all of the social resources. For instance, you can't rent a hotel room until you're 21 in some cases, can't rent a car in some states till you're 25, right? So it's this ambiguous sort of period. It's often described as a period that comes with both opportunities and risks. Opportunities from the perspective that because you're not yet an adult, you can take advantage of things and try new things that you will not have the same. You would not have the same opportunity to do when you're an adult. You can try out sports, you can try out hobbies, you can try out jobs that once you have family formed, you might not have those same opportunities. It's also one that comes with a lot of risk because some of those opportunities you might be taking advantage of, maybe sexual activity. You could be exposed to some diseases that you'll never ever get rid of. You could become pregnant that will you once having parented a child, always having parented a child. So it's both a time, and there's this phenomena of the adolescent understanding of mortality that later on in life you will be more fearful, I guess is a good way to say it. This is physiologically, this period begins at puberty and is thought to end when puberty is complete. We're defining puberty, so I think our textbook uses the range of 12 to 20 is considered adolescence. That's a pretty big range, and some of you may still, by that definition, still be considered an adolescent, right? But puberty, for our purposes, is when your body begins to sexually mature, which you all probably know happens about 2 years sooner for girls than it does for boys. So if you think back to sixth, seventh grade, the girls were often taller, more sexually mature than the boys. And this is happening faster and faster. If you refer to your chapter outline here, there's a bolded term called secular trend. And secular trend is a fancy word for saying that puberty, this sexual maturity of our bodies, is happening sooner and sooner. And there's a couple theories suggested as to why this is. One certainly has to do with nutrition, that we have access to healthy food is easier today than it was historically. Another has to do with, hey, stop it, right? Another has to do with healthcare, right? But for girls, there's an interesting theory that observes that when pubescent or prepubescent girls are in the company of older girls who have sexually matured, they will get their what's referred to as MINCE, another important word from the chapter outline, MINCE, MenArche, and that's her first period. But when younger girls are in the company of older girls, they will get their periods sooner. So there are some that are advocating for keeping sixth graders out of middle school, because when we move the sixth grade girls up to the middle school, they get their periods sooner. So that's sort of an interesting, and a question that I might ask you is, how do you feel about that? How would you Do you remember, girls especially, I would ask if we were in the same room together, do you remember the girl who sexually matured the first? I do. It was very significant for my social. I can even tell you her name, right? Also worth pointing out in this particular topic is the difference between primary and secondary sexual characteristics. Primary are those characteristics that we can see, right? Your breasts, your facial hair, your Adam's apple would probably be considered a primary. Secondary character. Oh, I'm sorry, I have that confused. Primary are the ones we cannot see. I thought that didn't sound right. So this would be your uterus, your ovaries, your testes. Those are the ones that we can't see. It's secondary. Those are the ones that we can see. Those are your breasts, your Adam's apple, your facial hair, right? And then the question is what is the social implication for early or late sexual maturity? And there's some debate, right? Generally the sense is that girls who sexually mature sooner are become more sexually active sooner, and boys who yes, girls who sexually mature sooner are more likely to become sexually active because they attract the attention of older boys. Girls who develop later may suffer socially, but the long-term physiological, in fact, the later that they sexually mature, the long and lean, they're more likely to be long and lean. So when girls sexually mature younger, they're more likely to be short, right? Shorter and stockier girls, but the later that you sexually mature. And then the question is, in sociology we say that the earlier or later sexual maturity depends on who the person is. So when I was growing up, it was a popular girl that sexually matured first, and so therefore it became a popular thing. But this also speaks to when girls sexually mature sooner, they get the attention of older boys, and that can make her popular. So it's sort of a paradox, but it's worth sort of thinking about what are the consequences. Do you remember being in middle school and high school, the way your social group, their attitude towards those who develop sooner, or those, it's harder socially, it's harder for boys to develop later because they are also already 2 years behind, right? So they're already going to be 2 years behind their female counterparts. And then if they're also behind their male counterparts, this can, especially in a community or a culture where athletics is really important. Moving on to the next slide here. And this is simply an image of, and this is one that I've talked about from the earlier part of the semester, and that's how the adolescent brain develops. It's important, and I think this makes sense as we move throughout the rest of the topics, but the brain develops essentially from the back to the front. And if you remember, the back is where we have the motor, the physical. So an adolescent will develop their athletic prowess, their major muscle, their athletic ability, their physical, their motor skills first. Then in the middle, we have the emotions, right? So sometimes teenagers are described as being really emotional. And it is true. Well, it's not true. They're not any more emotional than anybody else. But because the last part of their brain is this executive center, the center of their brain that is supposed to control how they respond to their emotions, they will emote. They will be, it's not that they're more moody, but you will see that they'll demonstrate a more rapid or irrational emotional reaction. They are not any more emotional than adults, but what adults have is their executive, the part of the brain, the last part of their brain to develop, is controlling their emotional center of their brain. So I think this is what, for me, this was sort of an aha, oh, that makes sense now, is that their brain develops from the back, right? Your athletic ability. The last part is the part of the brain that says, oh, this is how I should use my emotions, or I should respond physically. Then we move to the topic of physical and mental health. On this slide, it's simply, and in each of the chapters we talk about some of the risk factors. What I think is important to point out here is two things, really. Three. One is that this is the time in a person's life where they need they need the most sleep, right? Early in infancy, they needed a lot of sleep, but during adolescence, they need a lot of sleep too. Ironically, this is the time in our life where we're getting the least amount of sleep, right? So you're in high school, you have a job, maybe you're on the athletic team, you have social life, you're staying up late. And if it's like all the other schools around here, high school starts before elementary school. So at the time of your life where your biological clock has you staying up later into the evening and sleeping later into the morning, our high schools are doing that in reverse. In Manhattan high school started at 7:45 in the morning. Like it was totally backwards, where elementary school kids were getting up earlier, right? Getting up earlier and going to bed earlier, but their school didn't start till 8:30. It was backwards for the high school. So if during high school you found it hard to get up and you felt like you were always tired, that was yes, that was part of your physical development, and our culture was not accommodating your physical needs. Also during this period of time, this is a sort of a sad pattern, is that body images for boys increases. So boys start to feel better about the way their body looks, right? Especially during the latter part of adolescence when they begin to sexually mature. But girls' sense of body image actually begins to decline. It begins to decline during middle school. And so it's synced right up with puberty. And some sociological thinkers and feminists have observed that that's because um, we stigmatize or we shame women we shame girls. We treat their bodily processes in a sort of a negative kind of way. But I'll leave that for you to decide. Also important here is if you looked at also in this box, we talk about the number one cause of death in adolescence. And I think that's a quiz question. The number one cause of death in adolescence is accidents, particularly vehicle accidents. This is associated with some of these other things, right? With the fact that our frontal lobe, right, this risk and opportunity phenomena, right, that the part of the brain that says, oh, that's not real smart, that part is not completely formed. So we're taking risks and engaging in dangerous behavior. We're also not terribly practiced necessarily at driving. But yet, yes, so we're not practiced. We actually become better drivers at the longer we've been on the road. So you get a 16, 17 year old person and they're feeling really confident, right? And so they're making risky behaviors. Also noted here is the difference between anorexia and bulimia. This is when these things start to show up. Anorexia, hopefully you remember some of this from your psychology class. So anorexia is a phenomena of not maintaining a healthy body weight. So these people look very skinny. Bulimia is when they eat a lot, they maintain a normal body weight, and then they purge. Um, Anorexia is more likely to kill you, because when people get to the point of starving themselves, their organs begin to shut down. This has for a long time been thought of as a feminine problem, as a female problem, but the data is showing us increasingly that young men are developing some of these eating disorders as well. I'm going to stop that there, and when we come back on the next slide, we'll talk about some sexual identity development and some cognitive aspects.